Hey, friends, come in, come in. Grab that blanket by the old stone fireplace. I need to tell you about the Thanksgiving that nearly shattered my life. It wasn't about the turkey or the pie, it was about the cold, hard realization that sometimes, the ones you love most can see your safe harbor not as refuge, but as spoils of war. And that, mise-en-me, is a moment that changes everything. My name is Martha Oakley, and I'm 72 years old. I live in a house that sits right on the edge of the world. Here in coastal Maine, when Arthur, my late husband, and I bought this place 40 years ago, it was a wreck. A glorious wreck with a view of the Atlantic that could steal your breath. We rebuilt it with our own hands and 40 years of a teacher's modest salary. This house, this gray ledge cottage, it isn't just wood and stone. It's the physical manifestation of being debt-free in America. It's what we fought for, what we saved for. N'est-ce pas? In November, the sea wind here isn't a gentle caress, it's a bitter, relentless entity that rattles the window panes and reminds you of how exposed you are. And that November, the cold seemed to seep right through the walls, settling into my bones long before the snow started to fall. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the already clean granite counter, the granite Arthur insisted on. The one I used to complain was too cold, when I heard the tires crunching on the gravel drive. They were here, Ben, my son, and his wife, Chloe, and the children. I paused, my hand resting on the counter. I didn't rush to the door. I just listened, beyond the mournful sound of the distant foghorn, a sound that usually brings me comfort. There was a strained silence from the driveway. No excited shouts, just the sigh of the car door, heavy with defeat. Ben and Chloe's arrival wasn't a reunion, it was a relocation. Ben walked in first, my boy. He used to fill a room with his light. A fierce investigative journalist who chased down corruption like it owed him money. Now, his shoulders were slumped like an old winter coat, and his eyes were hollowed out, dark rings beneath them that spoke of sleepless nights in a tiny, overpriced Boston apartment. He hugged me hard, clinging for a moment longer than usual, and I could smell the stale scent of desperation and cheap takeout on his cashmere sweater. Mom, he murmured into my hair, we're so sorry about this. Nonsense, mon chéri, I said, pulling back to look at his face. You're home, that's all that matters. But my words felt brittle, like the thin ice forming on the tide pools outside. Then came Chloe. Oh, Chloe, she's 45, but she carries herself with the frantic, perfect tension of a woman half her age running a marathon. She used to manage hedge funds. She lived for the high-stakes pressure of the financial district. Now, she stood in my entryway, not looking at me, but scanning the original wood beams above her head. Her thin lips pursed. Her designer wool coat was a sharp contrast to the faint, pervasive aroma of baked bread and sea salt that always clings to my home. Thank you, Martha, she said. Her voice was too loud, too bright, like breaking glass. This is quaint, temporarily, of course, until Ben is rehired and we can recover our equity in Boston. You know, with Timmy's medical bills, losing that house was simply not an option. She didn't need to elaborate. I knew the story, the common American tragedy. 6 figures in student debt they'd never paid down. Ben losing his job over a technicality. And then the crushing blow of their youngest son, Timmy, needing specialized cardiac surgery that even their premium insurance barely touched. They were broken, financially and spiritually. The sunroom, Martha, Chloe continued, removing her coat with the precision of a surgeon. She handed it to Ben without looking at him, a silent command. The master suite. We need a quiet place for Ben to take calls and a window with better light for the children's distance learning. I'd offered them the main guest room. It was spacious, with a stunning view of the inlet. But the master suite, that was where Arthur and I had shared 30 years of peace. The room was mine. I looked at Ben. He didn't meet my gaze. He busied himself with the luggage. His silence. That was the first piece of ground he gave away. And it cut deeper than any demand Chloe could make. I took a breath. The air, crisp and cold from the sea, held the unspoken truth between us. The master bedroom is upstairs. Chloe, I replied, my voice calm, but with a firmness that surprised even myself. It has the best view. But it also has my husband's desk, my books, and my life. The sunroom is perfectly suited for remote work and study. Chloe finally looked at me. Her eyes weren't angry, they were calculating, measuring the cost of my resistance. She let out a small, dramatic sigh, but it wasn't a sigh of exhaustion. It was a sigh of entitlement being briefly inconvenienced. Of course, Martha, c'est la vie, she said, twisting the French phrase into an insult. But if we're going to be here, we need to establish some parameters. This is temporary, yes, but we need to optimize the space for the family unit. We need to be the priority now, don't we? She didn't ask it as a question. She stated it as a declaration of war, cloaked in the language of familial necessity. And in that moment, seeing my son's bowed head and my daughter-in-law's entitlement, I stopped seeing this as a visit. I saw it for what it was, a hostile takeover of my sanctuary. The window rattled again, a sharp clack against the frame, as if the house itself was protesting the demand. The next morning, the air in the house was thick, not with the smell of the pine and salt I love, but with the stale aroma of fear and unwashed clothes from unpacked suitcases. Chloe was already on her laptop at the dining room table, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a frantic energy that made the whole space feel small. I retreated to my sunroom, the one I had suggested for their work. It was here, surrounded by Arthur's old botany books and the view of the Atlantic, that I allowed myself to reflect on the tragedy that had brought my family to this precipice. Ben, my brilliant Ben, he was crushed not just by unemployment, but by disgrace. That investigative piece in the Seattle Chronicle, the one he swore would win him a Pulitzer, had imploded over a single, carelessly sourced quote. His former colleagues, who once saw him as a titan, now whispered, unethical, and burnt out. He wasn't just unemployed, he was unemployable in the only field he knew. He wandered the house like a ghost, his shame a heavy, invisible backpack he couldn't take off. But the career was just the roof, the foundation was the debt. I looked out at the churning, gray ocean, and I could almost hear the cacophony of the city they had left behind, the frantic beep of a hospital monitor, the distant, mocking ring of a collection agency, the constant, dull roar of interest accumulating. Flashback. Boston. 2 years ago, I visited them just after Ben and Chloe bought their forever home, a beautiful, but ridiculously expensive, brownstone near their children's prestigious school. They were on top of the world. But even then, the cracks were showing. I remember sitting in their sleek, minimalist living room, the air conditioner fighting a losing battle against the humid Boston summer. Chloe was laughing, but her eyes held a spark of panic. It's a stretch, Martha, I won't lie, she confessed, swirling the ice in her pricey bourbon. The mortgage is killer, but it's the student loans. We're still staring down $180 for both of our graduate degrees. And mon Dieu, the kids' tuition, it's a treadmill, and if you slow down even for a second, the whole machine eats you alive. I hadn't liked her choice of words. Eats you alive. Then, 6 months ago, the machine nearly did just that. Their youngest, Timmy, needed that unexpected, emergency heart valve surgery, even with Ben's excellent, private health plan. The kind that costs nearly a loonie every minute just to maintain. The out-of-pocket costs were catastrophic. The American system doesn't care about your 6-figure salary or your graduate degree. It only cares about the bottom line. $150. Ben had whispered to me over the phone last August. His voice was flat, hollowed out. That's what's left after insurance. We used the entire emergency fund, liquidated all of Chloe's non-IRA investments, and then I lost the job. The bank is going to take the house. Mom, they're taking the brownstone. The weight of the city. It had literally crushed them. They weren't just moving to Maine, they were running from a financial avalanche. I snapped back to the present, the sight of the jagged gray rocks outside grounding me. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had abandoned their dream home, built on debt, to seek refuge in my debt-free, paid-in-full house. The house they had always politely referred to as rustic or charming. But remote. They didn't see the decades of sacrifice that went into this place. They just saw a liquid asset, a safe harbor they felt entitled to now that their own ship had sunk. I walked to the kitchen. Chloe was still at the table, now scrolling through job postings. I noticed her browsing history, not just for Ben, but for herself. But below the job sites, there was a tab open for Zillow, and she wasn't looking at local Maine properties. She was looking at luxury condos in Portland, and then, horrifyingly, the page for home equity lines of credit, Helix. That's when the knot in my stomach tightened. She wasn't planning to stay, she was planning to leverage. "Good morning, Chloe," I said softly, pouring my coffee. She flinched, quickly minimizing the browser window. "Martha, good morning. I was just organizing Ben's resume." Her perfect, porcelain smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, I'm starting to prepare the Thanksgiving menu," I continued, ignoring her lie. I was thinking of using Arthur's old sterling silver, the set he inherited from his mom. Chloe's eyes flickered to the cabinet where the silver was kept. "Oh, please don't, Martha. It's too much work. We should stick to disposable plates this year. Less stress." Nonsense. Ma chérie. Tradition matters, I insisted, testing her, especially when the world feels uncertain. "It's what reminds us who we are." She forced a laugh, a dry, brittle sound. "Well, I suppose that's the difference between us. Martha, I prefer to remember what we have, not what we had." She paused, leaning in conspiratorially. "Speaking of what we have, I noticed your boiler is quite old. And the sea air, it's doing a number on that back deck." She wasn't making small talk about home repairs. She was auditing my vulnerability. She was looking for expenses, for chinks in my armor that she could exploit to suggest that I, an old, isolated woman, couldn't handle this house on my own. I just smiled, taking a long, slow sip of my coffee. "I'm quite capable, thank you, Chloe, but you remind me, I need to make a phone call today, just to confirm the house's insurance rider. You know, to be thorough." Chloe nodded, satisfied, not realizing that the call I was about to make had nothing to do with flood insurance, and everything to do with the coastal covenant Arthur and I had established years ago. The game, my friends, had officially begun. I drove that afternoon, not towards the main town of Bar Harbor, but inland, where the spruce trees stood guard over the winding, narrow roads. The sun was low, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow-dusted landscape. The engine of my old Volvo hummed a familiar, comforting tune, a sound of reliability that contrasted sharply with the chaotic uncertainty back at the cottage. I was heading to the small, unpretentious office of Judge Alice Miller, Arthur's longtime friend and our family lawyer. Judge Miller wasn't just a legal advisor, she was the only other person who truly understood the quiet, cold logic behind the coastal covenant. As I sat in the judge's waiting room, staring at an aging portrait of the Maine coastline, my mind drifted back to the genesis of the trust. It wasn't born out of distrust for Ben. It was born out of Arthur's profound, working-class fear of financial vulnerability. Flashback. Portland. 5 years ago. The air in the hospital room was sterile and silent, save for the mechanical hiss of Arthur's oxygen machine. He was frail, his body ravaged by the cancer that had driven us to the brink of financial collapse. Despite our diligent savings, one evening, he was watching the news, a segment about a sweet, elderly couple in Florida who had been convinced by their own grandchild to sign over their deed, only to be left destitute. Arthur reached out and grasped my hand. His skin was parchment thin, but his grip was firm. "Martha," he whispered, the sound raspy, "I'm scared of this country. We taught Ben the value of $1. But the world taught him the value of $sign. When I'm gone, this house, this gray ledge cottage, it's a target. You are a target. Don't talk like that, mon amour," I pleaded, tears stinging my eyes. He ignored my plea. "We put our life into this house. 40 years. I won't let it become a prize for desperation. Not even Ben's." He coughed, a deep, painful sound. "I want you safe. Legally. Absolutely safe. I don't want your kindness to be mistaken for weakness." That week, we met with Alice Miller. We drafted the papers, not as a simple will, but as an irrevocable trust, named, simply, the Coastal Senior Defense Trust. The house was no longer Martha Oakley's property. It was the trust's primary asset. With myself as the lifelong director and primary resident, any major financial decision, especially selling or taking a mortgage, a HELOC, as Chloe was so interested in, required the unanimous vote of the three-member board, myself, Judge Miller, and the mayor of the next town over, a former student of mine. Arthur looked at the final signed documents, his professor's eye catching the neat, precise typeface. "This isn't about being suspicious, Martha," he'd said, folding the paper into a leather-bound folio. "It's about being prepared. It's our gambit against a world that preys on the vulnerable. Keep it close, ma chérie. Keep the covenant safe." Back in the judge's office, Judge Miller handed me a familiar, worn leather folio. Its corners were scuffed, but the gold leaf lettering was still visible, the Coastal Covenant. "The timing is étonnant, astonishing, Martha," Judge Miller said, leaning back. Her expression was grave. "Chloe called me this morning. She was asking, very casually, if I was still familiar with Arthur's estate. She used the word, liquidity, 3 times. My stomach tightened. Chloe was moving faster than I thought. She wasn't waiting for a crisis. She was trying to engineer one. She wants a HELOC. Alice. She needs money to stabilize her life in Boston, and she sees my debt-free house as her last option." I explained, the words tasting bitter. "She'll try to persuade Ben to convince me to sell, or at least leverage, and Ben, in his current state of shame, will give in." Judge Miller nodded, her lawyer's gaze sharp and unwavering. "Then we activate the emergency clause. Arthur designed it for exactly this scenario. Emotional blackmail masking financial threat. It's direct, unappealable, and completely legal. We need a physical act of provocation to trigger it, a clear and documented threat to your well-being or residency." I clutched the folio to my chest. An act of provocation. I felt a profound sense of calm settle over me. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was erecting a boundary wall with the strongest legal bricks Arthur and I could find. "Prepare the documents, Alice," I said, rising to my feet. "A notice of tenancy violation and the trust deed. I have a feeling the provocation will come soon. And I want the delivery to happen at the most symbolic, most public moment possible. Thanksgiving dinner, Martha?" Judge Miller suggested, raising an eyebrow. I smiled, a cold, calculating professor's smile that Arthur would have recognized. "Exactmon," I replied. "At the moment they expect me to be the most submissive. I will be the most sovereign." The game was no longer a matter of passive resistance. It was a perfectly planned, legal checkmate. Thanksgiving Day arrived, cold and brutally sunny. The light, usually so welcome in Maine, felt harsh, exposing every imperfection. The tiny crack in the antique dinner plate, the dust motes dancing in the air, and the enormous, gaping fissure running through my family. The cottage was filled with the sense of forced tradition, sage and roasting butter, cloves and cinnamon, all layered over the perpetual, damp smell of the ocean. I'd pulled out Arthur's beautiful, heavy sterling silver. Despite Chloe's protests, the silverware was a silent testament to longevity and sacrifice. And holding those cold, weighty forks was my own subtle way of planting my flag. I tried to keep the atmosphere light, asking my grandchildren about school, about their friends, but the conversation kept hitting snags. Those moments of conversational silence that feel louder than yelling. Ben, bless his heart, tried to help me carve the turkey. He was clumsy, his hands shaking slightly, the knife scraping awkwardly against the bone. He wasn't focused. He was already wrestling with the inner demons I knew he'd brought with him from the city. "Ben, mon chéri," I said gently, guiding his hand. "The grace is in the grain. Follow the grain." He just nodded, avoiding my eyes. "Right, the grain. Sorry, Mom, I'm out of practice. Out of practice with life. Pay it etra, perhaps," I thought to myself, knowing his real failure wasn't carving, but protecting his own mother. Finally, we sat down. We were 5, but the table felt huge. I had intentionally left one chair empty, Arthur's chair, right at the head of the table. It was draped with his favorite heavy wool cardigan. A silent, powerful reminder of the man who had built this sanctuary. Chloe, of course, was the first to address it. She was dressed impeccably, a shield of expensive cashmere against the cottage's rustic charm. She poured herself a glass of wine, a large one, before anyone else had been served. "Martha," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Do you think that's healthy? The empty chair? It's a bit morbid for the children. Non? It makes things quite heavy." My oldest grandson, David, a quiet, observant boy, looked up quickly. "It's a tradition, Chloe," I replied, my voice steady. "Arthur always said, the ones we've loved never truly leave the table. We just can't see them. It reminds us of gratitude, not absence." Chloe just gave a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Right, gratitude. I'm just trying to keep the mood forward thinking. We need to focus on opportunity, not melancholy." She launched into a monologue, detailing all the ways she was going to optimize the cottage for modern life: a new high-efficiency boiler, the removal of all those unnecessary old books, and of course, the refinancing of the property for operational capital. The subtext of her entire speech was clear: "You are old. Martha, you are inefficient. We are taking over." Ben just ate, his eyes glued to his plate. He piled the stuffing high, a man seeking comfort in carbohydrate overload. His silence was deafening. It was the sound of a man who had already chosen his side, the path of least resistance. I watched Chloe as she held court, her energy frantic, her gaze constantly flitting to the sterling silver and then to my face, gauging my reaction. She wasn't celebrating, she was performing for a loan officer. When it came time to serve the pumpkin pie, the air was brittle. I made sure everyone had a generous slice. And then, as was my custom, I picked up my own dinner plate to serve myself. That was the moment, the exact moment the pressure cooker exploded. Chloe slammed her wine glass down. A sharp clack that echoed in the sudden, shocking silence of the dining room. She leaned forward, her eyes hard, suddenly dropping the sweet veneer. Her voice was low and dangerous, a razor blade wrapped in velvet. "You know, Martha," she began, her gaze raking over my simple sweater and comfortable shoes. "You've always been so sweet, so accommodating. But you're right, this house is a liability. Ben and I are taking enormous financial risks to stabilize the family. And frankly, we need to see more effort from you." She took a slow, deliberate sip of wine, then finally delivered the blow I had been anticipating since I saw the Zillow tab. "From now on, the rules change. We pay the bills now. We manage the assets. You are no longer the head of this house. Take your plate, and since you're so sentimental about tradition, go enjoy your dinner outside with the gulls. They love pie crust. Show some humility. Martha, your time at the head of the table is over." The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was the sound of a broken boundary, a deep, visceral violation of dignity. Ben's fork clattered onto his plate. David looked down, tears welling in his eyes. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even drop my smile. My smile was cold, controlled, and utterly genuine. It was the smile of a predator who had just watched her prey walk directly into the trap she had meticulously set years ago. The silence wasn't the kind you could cut with a knife. It was the kind that sucked the air out of the room, leaving a vacuum where laughter and gratitude should have been. The only sound was the faint, distant whoosh of the ocean outside, relentlessly reminding us of the vast, cold world beyond the glass. I stood there, my hand still holding my dinner plate, the warm ceramic a strange comfort against the sudden, icy stillness. Chloe's demand, "Go enjoy your dinner outside with the gulls," was a humiliation so perfect, so utterly targeted, that it bypassed anger and landed squarely on dignity. She hadn't just insulted me, she had tried to erase my status as the mistress of this house, reducing me to a trespasser, a beggar at my own table. I looked at Ben. His face was a mask of ashamed pallor. He didn't look at me, nor at his wife. He looked at the cranberry sauce, studying its smooth, gelatinous surface as if the secrets of the universe were hidden within. He was drowning in his own silence. His journalistic integrity, the very thing he'd built his career on, now suffocated by his shame and financial ruin. His silence was the true betrayal. And that's when the small, cold smile spread across my face. It wasn't amusement. It was the smile of absolute, Clinical certainty. It was the moment the retired professor, who had dedicated her life to logic and language, realized she was about to deliver the perfect lesson. Is that so, Chloe? I asked. My voice was low, so calm it sounded like the smooth, polished stones on the beach outside. You believe the rules are changing because you are now the financial authority here? Chloe, emboldened by my lack of immediate outrage and mistaking my calm for surrender, puffed out her chest. She reached for the wine bottle. Exactly, Martha. It's simply business. You've been so generous, but this is a liability we need to manage. The cruel calculus. This was the opening I needed. The explicit statement of financial threat. I placed my plate down with absolute precision, the porcelain making a quiet clink against the linen tablecloth. I then met Chloe's gaze, my eyes holding hers without blinking. I reached for the small leather-bound folio I had carefully placed on the mantelpiece before dinner. The Coastal Covenant. Let me tell you about liability. Chloe, I began, my voice cutting through the holiday music faintly playing in the background. Do you know what $150 in out-of-pocket cardiac surgery bills looks like when you're facing a career scandal and a high-interest mortgage in Boston? Chloe blinked, momentarily confused by the sudden, brutal shift of conversation to her own pain. Martha, what does this? It looks like desperation. Ma chérie, I finished for her. It looks like you desperately trying to persuade Ben, who is already broken by failure, to convince his grieving mother to take out a home equity line of credit, HELOC. So you can leverage my debt-free home to save your debt-ridden life in Boston. Ben finally looked up, his eyes widening in horror, realizing I had seen the Zillow tab, the HELOC application, the depth of their secret shame. Mom, non, he stammered, his voice choked. It wasn't, we were just looking at options. And I was merely preparing options for myself. Mon fils, I countered, my eyes lingering on his. I was trying to show him that his silence was the greater fault. The quiet strike. Activating the covenant. I opened the folio, not to show them the documents, but to retrieve the single object inside, the small, rugged satellite phone Arthur had bought for emergencies in this remote coastal area. The phone was heavy and practical, a symbol of preparedness that contrasted sharply with the elegant, meaningless Thanksgiving spread. I lifted it to my ear and pressed the first speed dial. Everyone watched me, the grandchildren silent with fear, Ben frozen with guilt, and Chloe, her face now completely white, confusion warring with renewed anger. Who are you calling, Martha? Ben, faites quelque chose, do something, Chloe hissed. I ignored her. I waited 3 seconds for the connection to establish, listening to the high-pitched digital whine. Judge Miller, I said clearly into the mouthpiece, my voice entirely lacking in emotion. It's Martha. I am officially activating the emergency protocol of the Coastal Senior Defense Trust. I paused, letting the formal, heavy words hang in the air. The required act of provocation has been committed and documented by witness testimony. The physical and psychological boundary of the lifelong director has been violated with clear intent to force financial leverage. I looked directly at Chloe, whose jaw had dropped open in genuine panic. Alice, please contact the mayor and the Coast Guard detail immediately. I need the notice of tenancy violation and the deed of trust delivered by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Make sure they understand. The current occupants are no longer guests. They are hostile squatters. I closed the satellite phone with a quiet click and placed it back neatly in the leather folio. Then, I picked up my dinner plate. I picked up my knife and fork. And I began to eat my turkey and stuffing as if nothing had happened. The sounds of my chewing unnaturally loud in the dead silence of the dining room. The food is getting cold, I stated, looking around the table, my smile utterly serene. And tomorrow, we will discuss the new rules of engagement. Enjoy your pie, mes enfants. The click of the satellite phone wasn't loud, but in the echoing silence of the dining room, it sounded like a shot across the bow. I continued to eat my turkey, savoring the richness of the gravy, the sharp tang of the cranberry sauce. Every sense was heightened. The clinking of my silverware was a deliberate assertion of control. The smell of burnt sage from the oven seemed suddenly symbolic of our charred family relations. I glanced up, Chloe was a study in pure, unadulterated panic. Her porcelain veneer had finally shattered. She wasn't angry anymore, she was scared. The color had drained from her face, leaving a sickly gray-green hue that clashed terribly with her expensive cashmere. "Martha, what was that?" she demanded, her voice a reedy whisper, far removed from the loud, commanding tone she'd used moments before. "Who is Alice? And what is the emergency protocol?" I chewed slowly, enjoying the moment of absolute dominion. A professor knows that silence is the best teacher. Ben, my son, was the more immediate concern. He wasn't scared for his finances, he was terrified for his mother's sanity. He looked at me with the same desperate confusion he must have felt when his career imploded. "Mom, please," he stammered, leaning across the table, his hand reaching out but not quite touching mine. "Are you all right? Is this about the stress?" "That was Judge Miller, wasn't it? You know we love you. You don't need to do anything drastic." "Drastic, Ben?" I set my fork down deliberately. "Is it drastic to ensure one's legal survival when facing a hostile, financially motivated takeover? Is it drastic to implement a plan your own father helped devise to protect his wife and his legacy from desperation and poor judgment?" My oldest grandson, David, the quiet observer, was the only one whose eyes held a flicker of understanding. He was looking not at me, but at the leather folio next to my plate, then back at the empty chair draped with his grandfather's cardigan. Chloe regained some composure, leaning on her old corporate habits. "Regroup. Deny. Attack. This is insane. Martha, you're trying to leverage our financial problems for emotional gain." She sneered, though the tremor in her voice gave her away. "You've been alone for too long. You can't just call a lawyer on Thanksgiving and declare us hostile squatters. That's not how the American legal system works." "Oh, but it is, Cherie," I replied, taking a slow, calming sip of water. "When the asset in question is held in an irrevocable trust with myself as the director, and the legal documentation clearly defines hostile action as any attempt to force financial encumbrance on the property. Your threat to leverage the house for your Boston debt, coupled with your explicit command to remove me from my own table, satisfies the legal criteria perfectly." I gestured around the table. "You all just witnessed the breach of the covenant. The papers were filed at the county clerk's office the moment I made that call. Now, the law takes over." Ben buried his face in his hands, a sound of absolute, broken despair escaping his lips. "The trust, the coastal covenant," he mumbled, the name finally connecting in his memory. "Dad talked about protecting the house, but I thought it was just a philosophy. Arthur was a linguist. Ben, we didn't deal in philosophy, we dealt in precise, unbreakable language." I corrected him softly. "And the covenant isn't just a document. It's a shield that costs $0 a month to maintain, protecting us from the system that charged your family $150 for a single surgery. It's a defense against the very desperation that drove your wife to try and throw me out with the gulls." I saw the raw emotion on Chloe's face twist into pure, cold fury again, but before she could launch another attack, I held up my hand, a teacher commanding attention. "We will finish our Thanksgiving dinner. D'accord? You will all have pie. And tomorrow morning, when Judge Miller and the Coast Guard officer arrive, we will have a legal meeting. Until then, you are under the legal observation of the trust." I looked at Ben, my heart aching, but my resolve steady. "Ben, your shame made you blind. Your silence was a choice. Now, you have one night to decide. Are you the heir to a philosophy of dignity? Or are you just another desperate claimant to an asset you didn't earn?" The rest of the meal passed in a state of absolute, petrified silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The silverware lay heavy and unused on the fine china. Chloe sat rigid, her eyes darting between me and the phone. Ben sat motionless, his head bowed, the weight of the city pressing down on him, now compounded by the crushing weight of his mother's calculated defense. I, Martha Oakley, finished my dinner, savoring every bite of the cold turkey, knowing that the confrontation had not broken me. Instead, it had finally re-anchored me to the quiet, unshakable foundation that Arthur and I had built on the Maine coastline. The night was long and frigid. I barely slept, not out of fear, but out of a deep, anticipatory calm. I was a scientist awaiting the results of a years-long experiment. I could hear muffled, frantic arguing from the guest room down the hall, Chloe's sharp, high voice overriding Ben's exhausted, defeated murmurs. The sounds were evidence. The coastal covenant was working. It had stripped away the facade and exposed the raw, ugly desperation underneath. I rose before dawn. I made coffee, strong, dark, Maine coffee, and sat in Arthur's chair by the kitchen window. The eastern horizon was turning a bruised, cold purple. The doorbell rang precisely at 9 a.m. It wasn't the tentative chime of a guest, it was the firm, authoritative brr ring of official business. I opened the door. Standing on my porch, silhouetted against the blinding, cold morning light, were three figures. Judge Alice Miller, immaculate in a Navy suit, Chief Warrant Officer Davies of the local Coast Guard, a man of imposing height and quiet authority, and Mayor Thompson, the third board member, clutching a thick manila envelope. Their presence wasn't just legal, it was communal. They were the living embodiments of the Maine community Arthur and I had trusted. I ushered them into the living room, the space that had hosted so many joyous holidays. The air felt heavy, oppressive, thick with the ghosts of last night's betrayal. Ben and Chloe were already there, waiting. Chloe was dressed, ready for a fight, her posture rigid. Ben was still in a sweatshirt, his hair messy, looking like a man who hadn't slept or showered. "Good morning," I said simply, gesturing towards the visitors. "We have company. Everyone, please take a seat. This is a formal meeting of the Coastal Senior Defense Trust." Chloe immediately went into denial mode. "A trust? Martha, this is ridiculous. This is harassment. Ben, call our lawyer in Boston. S'il vous plaît, please." Ben didn't move. He simply stared at the uniformed officer. Judge Miller took the floor, her voice trained to cut through courtroom chaos. She didn't waste a single precious word. "The purpose of this meeting is to inform the current residents, Mr. and Mrs. Oakley, of the official legal standing of this property. As of 9:01 a.m. this morning, following the activation of the emergency protocol by the Trust's director, Mrs. Martha Oakley, this property is legally and irrevocably owned by the Coastal Senior Defense Trust." She looked directly at Chloe, then at Ben. "Mr. Oakley, Mrs. Oakley, I am serving you with two documents." Mayor Thompson stepped forward and solemnly placed the large envelope on the antique mahogany table. The gesture was slow, deliberate, heavy with implication. "First," Judge Miller continued, "a copy of the deed of trust, filed 5 years ago. Second, a notice of tenancy violation and provisional eviction, pursuant to the Trust's bylaws." The silence returned, but this time, it was the sound of a tidal wave retreating. It was the sound of Ben and Chloe's entire financial plan collapsing into sand. Chloe snatched the papers, her eyes racing over the legal jargon. "This is insane. This is fraud. Edward, Ben, your mother is signing her house over to strangers. She's clearly senile. We need to have her legally committed." Chief Warrant Officer Davies, who had been standing silently by the window, spoke. His voice was deep, slow, and utterly commanding. "Mrs. Oakley is the director of the trust. Ma'am, I have personally reviewed the documents. This is perfectly legal and in order. Furthermore, any attempt to harass or threaten the director is a violation of the emergency protective order accompanying this notice." Chloe stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "A protective order." The word carried the full, terrifying weight of the state. Ben finally looked at me, not with anger, but with profound, heartbreaking shame. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking, "why didn't you trust me? I'm your son. I would never have let her sell the house. And that, Ben, is the very core of the matter," I replied, standing up to face him. I walked towards the empty chair, my hand resting gently on Arthur's cardigan. "This is not about trust," I explained, looking him straight in the eye. "It's about systemic reality. You were a journalist. You know how this country preys on vulnerability. Your father and I established this trust not to punish you, but to secure my dignity against the kind of desperation, driven by six-figure debts and crushing medical bills, that turns loving children into unwitting accomplices." I looked at Chloe, now defeated, sitting heavily on the sofa. I saw the Zillow tab. Chloe, I saw the HELOC application. Your plan wasn't to stay and heal, it was to leverage and flee. You were treating this sanctuary, built with 40 years of sacrifice, as your last, disposable asset. My trust simply ensured that the house's original purpose, security for the elderly, remained its only purpose. Judge Miller stepped in to deliver the final, crushing details. The trust allows for 2 options. Mr. Oakley, option 1. You and Mrs. Oakley can sign a formal, 1-year lease agreement with the trust. You would pay fair market rent directly to the trust, making you tenants, not owners. The trust would then use that income to fund other coastal initiative projects, helping other seniors secure their deeds. And option 2? Ben asked, his voice defeated. Option 2, Judge Miller stated, is that you vacate the premises within 30 days. I watched Ben's shoulders slump. The rental amount, though fair for a coastal property, was utterly beyond their current means. They were trapped. I stepped forward, offering my son a hand not of surrender, but of sober conditionality. There is a third path. Ben, mon fils, I said, my voice softening, yet retaining its steel core. You and the children can stay for a probationary period, rent-free, on one single, non-negotiable condition: absolute, unconditional respect for myself as the director, and for my home. Chloe must offer a complete, public apology for her actions at the table, not just to me, but to this family and this community. I looked at Chloe, whose eyes were fixed on the floor, and she must also acknowledge that her desperate attempts to manage my life were a direct result of her own unmanaged desperation and seek professional help. The choice, I concluded, is yours. Do you stay here and rebuild your lives with dignity and accountability? Or do you leave and try to find a system that is kinder to the desperate than I have been forced to be? The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't confusion. It was the silence of consequence. The next few weeks were steeped in an awkward, fragile quiet. The house, usually so peaceful, now felt like a disarmed bomb. Ben started putting in 10-hour days at my old sunroom desk, searching for work with a desperate intensity I hadn't seen since his college days. He had been stripped of his arrogance, replaced by a quiet, determined humility. Chloe, however, was gone. She had packed a single suitcase and left for a sister's place in Miami, saying she needed space to process. I knew she was fleeing the shame, but it was also the best thing for everyone. The separation provided the necessary air for the family to breathe and heal. One evening, I found Ben by the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames, holding Arthur's old chess set. The silence is the worst part, Mom, he confessed, not looking at me. My silence. I let the fear of losing money make me deaf to your dignity. I was so ashamed of the debt, of losing my job, that I just let Chloe take the wheel. Your shame was a weight, Ben, I replied, sitting beside him. It blinded you, but the greatest strength is not in avoiding failure, mon fils, but in having the courage to rebuild with honest bricks. The coastal initiative at work. While Ben wrestled with his conscience, I watched a different kind of growth in my grandson, David. He became fascinated by the Coastal Senior Defense Trust. He spent hours with me, organizing the documents, reading the bylaws, asking intelligent questions. Grandma Martha, he asked one afternoon, his eyes earnest, did Grandpa Arthur really know you'd be this strong? Did he know the covenant would be the thing that saved us? Arthur knew the house was strong. Cherie, I replied, tracing the worn binding of the trust folio. He just made sure the law had my back when I finally remembered my own strength. He protected my sovereignty, not my vulnerability. The apology and the deed. Exactly 3 weeks after the Thanksgiving confrontation, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't the rental Chloe had arrived in, it was a taxi. Chloe emerged, dressed simply, without the aggressive armor of designer clothes. She looked tired, smaller, and, for the first time since she'd arrived, vulnerable. She walked into the living room, where Ben, David, and I were discussing the foundation's next steps. She didn't offer excuses or make demands. She simply stood before me, her hands clasped tightly. Martha, she began, her voice steady but low. I have spent 3 weeks talking to a therapist and looking at my life. I haven't been running from the city's debt. I've been running from the fear of being powerless. She looked at Ben, her eyes softening, and I tried to control the one person, the one asset, I thought couldn't fight back. I was wrong. What I said at the Thanksgiving table, telling you to eat with the gulls, was cruel, unforgivable, and a direct reflection of my own desperation and lack of self-respect. She looked directly at me, meeting my gaze. I am profoundly sorry, Martha, not because you have a legal trust, but because I violated your dignity in your own home. I accept your conditions. I will seek therapy, and I will respect your boundaries. And I want to sign the lease agreement. We will pay the rent to the trust. Because this house deserves to be a sanctuary for others, not just a tool for my leverage. It wasn't an easy apology, but it was genuine. It acknowledged the pain and the power dynamic. I simply nodded. I accept your apology, Chloe. Forgiveness isn't a single act, it's a mutual path. We start here, with respect, mending the fence. 2 months later, the Coastal Senior Defense Trust received its first rent check from Ben and Chloe Oakley. It was a symbolic, powerful payment that secured my dignity and helped fund the foundation's work. On a crisp Saturday morning, the family gathered outside. The old, broken picket fence, the symbol of the family's old, cracked facade, was still leaning precariously against the sea wind. Ben, wearing Arthur's heavy tool belt, picked up a hammer. Chloe, without being asked, handed him the nails. David helped me hold the timber steady. This fence, I said, my voice rich with the wisdom of the coastal professor. It's a boundary. It keeps the wild world out and the safety in. But boundaries only work if we respect the line. We worked together, the rhythmic thud of the hammer against the wood creating a new, strong cadence. As the final panel was secured, standing straight and proud against the blue sky, I looked at my family. Ben, working with purpose. Chloe, present and quiet. David, learning the value of construction, both physical and emotional. This Thanksgiving, the one we actually celebrated, the empty chair was still draped with Arthur's cardigan. But the conversation was different. It was honest, it was quiet, and when Ben proposed a toast, he raised his glass not to money or career, but to me, to Mom, he said, his voice husky with genuine emotion. To the woman who taught us that the greatest asset isn't debt-free property, but debt-free dignity. Thank you for teaching us. Maman, thank you for the covenant. I smiled, raising my glass of cider. I hadn't needed to shout. I hadn't needed to cry. I had simply needed to stand on the strength Arthur and I had built. Both in the legal papers and in my own spirit. I was Martha Oakley, the professor who proved that the quietest voice, armed with the sharpest legal pen, can always reclaim her chair at the table. The story of Martha Oakley and the Coastal Senior Defense Trust is not simply a tale of family conflict. It's a profound lesson in dignity and proactive self-sovereignty. A message desperately needed in a country where financial and emotional burdens often lead to broken homes. Martha's victory was not won with shouting or tears, but with the quiet, calculated strength of a woman who chose preparedness over passive trust. We often believe that love should be enough to protect us from those we cherish. Yet, Martha's journey shows us the harsh reality. When overwhelming pressures like crippling medical debt, student loans, and unemployment enter the equation, even the deepest familial bonds can fracture, turning loved ones into desperate adversaries. Her realization was stark. To maintain kindness, she first had to establish an unassailable legal boundary. The Coastal Covenant wasn't an act of distrust against her son. It was an act of self-respect against the systemic vulnerability that preys on the elderly and the financially desperate alike. The ultimate lesson here is one of empowerment. Your vulnerability is an asset you must actively protect. Don't wait for the Thanksgiving table to turn into a battlefield. Take the time now to establish clear, legally sound boundaries for your home and your legacy. True familial harmony isn't built on silent compliance. It's built on mutual respect enforced by clear, non-negotiable legal language. Martha reclaimed her chair at the table because she had the courage to value her dignity over a false sense of peace. Mise en me. If Martha's journey resonates with your own struggles to set boundaries or protect your future, don't hold that experience inside. We are stronger together. Share your story of setting a Covenant, in the comments below. What boundary did you enforce? And how did it change your relationship for the better? May your home be a place of both love and unyielding respect. Prenez bien soin de vous. Take good care of yourselves. Sparkling heart.